I'll write the story now. Let me first check the band names list to make sure all new characters are completely original. The band names are Robert, Daniel, Renee, Cooper, Walter, Patrice, Darren, Beverly, Raymond Calloway, Marcus, Gregory, Philip, Lawrence, Claire, Trevor, Otis, Naomi, Jaden, Tyler, Mrs. Hannigan, Aaron, Vanessa, Harold. I didn't plan to walk back into that place. Not after 7 years. Not after what they did. But there I was, standing in the gravel parking lot of the Callaway Steakhouse, the restaurant my wife and I built from nothing, the one I named after her maiden name because she cried when I suggested it. Watching my son carry a tray of dirty dishes through the side entrance like he was just another busboy they hired off the street. He was wearing a white apron. Somebody else's name tag. I stood there long enough that the gravel started to hurt through the soles of my shoes. I'm 63 years old and I've had 2 knee replacements, so standing still is never comfortable for me. But I couldn't move. Not yet. My brain needed a minute to catch up with my eyes. The last time I had seen my son, he was 24. He had my wife's dark eyes and my stubborn jaw, and he laughed too loud at his own jokes, just like I always did. Now he was 31. Thinner than I remembered, and he was clearing a table for people who didn't even look up at him. 7 years. I need to back up. Because none of this makes sense unless you understand what I lost, and how I lost it, and who took it from me. My name is Edmund Hale. I was born in Macon, Georgia, the second of 4 boys, and I came up hard. My father worked at a tire plant for 31 years, and came home every night smelling like rubber and exhaustion. He never complained. That's the thing I remember most. He never complained. He just worked, and he saved, and he made sure we had what we needed. Not what we wanted. What we needed. There's a difference, and a lot of people my age forgot it somewhere along the way. I didn't forget. When I was 22, I got a job washing dishes at a diner outside of Savannah. 6 months later, I was cooking. 2 years after that, I was managing the lunch shift. I have never been a man with a plan so much as a man who just keeps moving forward, and forward kept leading me toward the restaurant business in ways I didn't fully understand until I was already deep inside it. I met my wife, Loretta, when I was 28. She was waiting tables at a place called Hector's on Broughton Street, and she had this way of remembering every regular customer's order without writing it down. Not just their food, their moods. She knew who needed extra time and who needed to be left alone and who needed someone to ask how they were doing and actually mean it. I watched her work for 3 Fridays in a row before I got up the nerve to say anything to her. We were married 11 months later. We spent the next 15 years saving and scraping and planning. And in 2001, we opened the Callaway Steakhouse in a strip mall in Augusta with 16 tables, a used commercial grill, and $12,000 in credit card debt. By 2008, we had 2 locations. By 2014, we had 5, and the flagship location in downtown Augusta had been written up in Georgia Magazine twice. Our son, Preston, grew up in those restaurants. He did homework at table 6. He learned to fold napkins before he learned to ride a bike. He had opinions about seasoning by the time he was 10 that were honestly better than some of the cooks I was paying. I always assumed he'd run it someday. Not because I forced him, I never forced him, but because it was in him the same way it was in me. Some things pass down without you trying. Loretta got sick in the winter of 2015. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 3 when they found it, stage 4 by February. She was gone by April. I don't talk about that period very much. I mention it here only because it's the reason everything else happened. Grief does things to a man. It doesn't excuse what I did next, but it explains it. My younger brother, Clifton, came to stay with me after the funeral. He said he'd help me manage the business while I got back on my feet. Clifton had always been the charming one, the one who knew how to talk to people, the one who made friends in 10 minutes that I couldn't make in 10 years. I trusted him the way you trust family. Automatically. Without evidence. That was my mistake. I had a stroke 8 months after Loretta died. They told me later it was likely stress-related, that grief had been sitting on my cardiovascular system like a stone, and my body finally gave out under the weight of it. I was 60 years old. I was alone in my house when it happened. My neighbor found me the next morning when she noticed my car hadn't moved. I was in the hospital for 9 days. I came home with a cane and a speech therapist and a left hand that didn't work the way it used to. The doctors were optimistic in that careful way. Doctors are optimistic when they're not sure what they're promising. The recovery took 3 years. 3 years during which Clifton, my brother, my blood, the man I let sleep in my guest room and drive my truck and sign checks on my behalf with the limited power of attorney I'd given him, was quietly and methodically dismantling everything I had built. He didn't do it all at once. That's the part that still makes me sick when I think about it. He was patient. He restructured the management agreements. He put his name on licensing paperwork. He convinced Preston, 26 years old, grieving his mother, scared for his father, that the cleanest thing for everyone was to transfer majority ownership of the operating company into a family trust that Clifton controlled. He told Preston it was to protect the assets in case I didn't fully recover. He told Preston it was what I would have wanted. Preston believed him. Of course he believed him. Clifton was family. Clifton was the one who'd been there every day while I was in the hospital. Clifton was the one who answered all the questions Preston didn't know how to answer. By the time I was well enough to ask real questions, 3 of the 5 locations had been sold. The proceeds had moved through accounts I didn't recognize into a holding company with Clifton's wife's name on it. The flagship location. The one we named after Loretta. The one with the 16 original tables and the used commercial grill and her handwriting on the original menu still framed above the host stand, had been transferred into an LLC that Preston technically owned a minority share of, but that Clifton controlled entirely, and Preston, my son, was working there. As a floor manager, technically. But from what I could see in the parking lot, he was doing a lot more than managing. I had spent a year trying to untangle the legal situation with a lawyer in Augusta who kept telling me that what Clifton had done was aggressive but possibly defensible, and that fighting it could cost me more than I'd recover. I spent another 6 months not knowing what to do, and then one Thursday morning I drove to Augusta, parked in the gravel lot across from the Callaway Steakhouse, and watched my son carry dirty dishes through the side door. I put the car in reverse and drove home. Then I made a different kind of plan. I went back the following Tuesday at lunch, and I sat in a booth by the window. I wore a baseball cap and a jacket I'd bought at a Goodwill in Milledgeville. I'm aware that sounds dramatic. I'm 63 years old, and I've had 2 knee replacements, and I was wearing a disguise in my own restaurant. But I needed to see it first. I needed to understand the full picture before I moved. The host who seated me was a young woman I didn't recognize. The menu had been redesigned. Same food mostly, but the layout was different, and they'd taken off 3 of Loretta's original dishes, including the smothered pork chops that had been on the menu since day 1. That bothered me more than I expected. I ordered coffee and the ribeye and I watched. Preston came out of the kitchen around 12:30. He stopped at 4 tables, checked on guests, handled a situation with a wrong order with the exact quiet efficiency that his mother used to handle things. He didn't see me. I was just another older gentleman in a corner booth. I watched him work for an hour and 20 minutes. He was good at it. He had always been good at it. But there was something in the set of his shoulders that I recognized from the mirror. A kind of tiredness that isn't physical. The tiredness of someone doing a job they love, in a situation they can't quite accept. When I left, I told the host the food was excellent. She smiled and said thank you, and I walked back to my car and sat there for a long time. I called my attorney that night, not the one in Augusta, a different one, a woman named Patricia Soto in Atlanta who specialized in business fraud and asset recovery. A friend of mine from my restaurant association days had used her 3 years ago in a dispute with a franchise partner and said she was the kind of lawyer who didn't tell you what you couldn't do. She told you what it would cost. I told her everything, all of it, the power of attorney, the trust, the LLC transfers, the sold locations, the accounts. I sent her the documents I had. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "How much of this did your brother do in writing?" I said, "Almost all of it. He'd been careful about paper trails in the beginning, but once he thought the situation was settled, he got sloppy. People who think they've won always get sloppy." She said, "Give me 3 weeks." I went back to the restaurant 2 more times during those 3 weeks. Different booth, different hat. I wasn't hiding from Preston. I was waiting for the right moment. I needed to know the full shape of what Clifton had done before I talked to my son, because the last thing I wanted was to walk in there and say the wrong thing and give Clifton any warning. The second visit I saw Clifton himself. He came in around 2 in the afternoon and sat at the bar. He was heavier than I remembered, and he was wearing a sport coat that cost more than my first car. He talked to the bartender like he owned the place, which, on paper, he mostly did. He didn't see me. I made sure of that. The third visit, I almost didn't go inside. I sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes, trying to decide if I was doing the right thing or just feeding something in myself that I was calling justice but might have been something uglier. I'm old enough to know the difference between righteous anger and pride, and I've confused the two before in ways I regret. I thought about Loretta. I thought about what she would say. She would say, "Go get what's yours, but do it clean." I went inside. I ordered the smothered pork chops off the specials board. Someone in the kitchen had brought them back, apparently. Or maybe they'd never fully left, and I ate alone at the corner booth, and I watched my son work, and I thought about my father coming home from the tire plant every night smelling like rubber. He never complained. He just worked. Patricia Soto called me on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after our first conversation. She didn't open with pleasantries. She said, "The power of attorney your brother used was improperly executed. There's a witness signature problem that invalidates the instrument, which means every transaction he made under that authority is legally vulnerable. All of them." I was sitting at my kitchen table. I had a cup of coffee in front of me that had gone cold. I said, "How vulnerable?" She said, "Reversal vulnerable, possibly criminal fraud vulnerable, depending on how the DA wants to look at it." I asked her what she needed from me. She gave me a list. Most of it I already had. Some of it I needed to get. She told me that before we filed anything, she wanted me to make one call, not to Clifton, not to a court, but to the IRS tip line. Because during her review of the financial documents I'd sent, she had found something she described as significant irregularities in how Clifton had been reporting income from the sold locations. She said, "Sometimes the fastest road to civil recovery runs through a federal investigation." I thought about that for a moment. I said, "How long does this take?" She said, "If the IRS moves fast, 6 to 8 months. If they don't, longer." But Edmund, they're going to move fast on this. She was right. They did. I called Preston in April, not to tell him everything, not yet, just to hear his voice. I had his number still, the same number from 7 years ago, and I held the phone for a long time before I pressed call. He picked up on the second ring. He said hello in the careful way people answer calls from numbers they don't recognize, and I said, "Preston, it's your dad." And there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough for me to count my own heartbeat. Then he said, "Dad." Just that. One word. But the way he said it, like something released that had been held under pressure for a long time, told me most of what I needed to know about the last 3 years. We talked for 2 hours that first night. I didn't tell him about Patricia Soto or the IRS yet. I told him I'd been getting stronger. I told him I thought about his mother every day. I asked him how he was doing, really, and he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "Honestly, Dad, not great. I feel like I'm running a place that isn't mine, for a man who doesn't respect it." I asked him if he knew what Clifton had done. He said he'd been starting to figure it out. He said he'd gone back and read the documents he'd signed 3 years ago, and some of it didn't look like what Clifton had told him it was. He said he'd been thinking about getting a lawyer, but he didn't know where to start. I said, "I've already started. I need you to trust me. Don't say anything to your uncle yet." "Can you do that?" He said yes. He said it without hesitating, and that meant everything to me. The IRS opened a formal investigation in May. I know this not because they told me directly, but because Clifton called me for the first time in 4 years on a Tuesday night in June, and his voice had a quality in it I hadn't heard before. Tinnitus. The kind of thin you hear in a man who's been sleeping badly. He said he'd been thinking about reaching out. He said he hoped I was doing better. He said the restaurants were doing well, and that he hoped there were no hard feelings about the business arrangements, that everything had been done with my best interest in mind. I listened to all of it. I didn't say much. I told him I was doing fine and that I hoped he was too. I told him the weather was nice in Macon. I said goodbye and I hung up. Patricia Soto had told me not to discuss the case with him under any circumstances. I didn't. He called twice more that month. I let it go to voicemail both times. The civil suit was filed in August. It was 47 pages long, and it named Clifton, his wife, and the holding company. The core allegation was that the power of attorney used to execute all the transfers was invalid from the start due to improper execution, and that every transaction that flowed from it constituted unauthorized conversion of assets, which is a polite legal term for theft. Patricia had also filed a separate motion to freeze the assets of the holding company pending resolution of the civil suit. The judge granted it. Clifton hired a lawyer. His lawyer called Patricia's office and suggested a settlement discussion. Patricia relayed the offer to me. Clifton would transfer back the flagship location and one of the 2 remaining operating locations and pay a cash settlement of $200,000. I said no. She said, "That's what I figured you'd say." I said, "I want it all, and I wanted on record what he did." She said, "That's going to take longer." I said, "I've got time." Preston came to see me in Macon in September. First time in over 3 years. I had fixed up the back porch, put in new boards, hung a ceiling fan, set out 2 chairs that faced the backyard where Loretta used to grow tomatoes. The tomatoes were gone now. Someday I'd plant them again. He looked like his mother around the eyes. He always did, but I hadn't seen it up close in so long that it stopped me for a moment when he came up the porch steps. We sat out there for most of the afternoon. He told me things he hadn't been able to say on the phone. About the years after the stroke, about how scared he'd been, about how Clifton had made everything seem so logical, so protective, and how he'd been too young and too lost to question any of it. About how he'd realized, slowly, over the past year, that the man he was working for had stolen from his father and used his own signature to do it. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I should have looked closer." I said, "You were 26 and you just lost your mother and almost lost me. Don't you carry that?" He looked at the yard for a while. Then he said, "What happens now?" I told him about Patricia, about the civil suit, about the IRS, about the asset freeze. I told him we weren't going to get it all back overnight, but we were going to get it back. And we were going to do it the right way, through courts and documentation and patience, because that's what your grandfather would have done, and that's what your mother would have wanted. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Can I help?" I said, "I was hoping you'd ask that." The IRS concluded their investigation in February of the following year. Clifton was assessed back taxes, penalties, and interest on income he had failed to report from the 3 locations he'd sold. Income that had moved through the holding company and been treated in a way that Patricia described to me as creative, and the IRS described as fraudulent. He agreed to a settlement with the federal government that included significant financial penalties. His wife's holding company was dissolved as part of the agreement. The civil case settled 4 months after that. Clifton's attorney stopped suggesting compromises and started suggesting we find a number that worked for everyone. The number we found transferred the flagship location and both remaining operating locations back to a new LLC that Preston and I hold jointly. Clifton also paid a cash settlement that covered most of my legal fees and 3 years of lost management income. He did not admit wrongdoing in the civil agreement. That was the one thing I had to accept that I didn't want to. Patricia told me getting a full admission would require going to trial, that trials are expensive and long and uncertain, and that we had recovered substantially everything of material value. She was right. I knew she was right, but I want to say it plainly here. Because this is my story, and I get to say it. My brother stole from me. He used my grief and my illness and my trust, and he stole from me and from my son. The legal settlement doesn't say that. I'm saying it. The Callaway Steakhouse reopened under new management in June. Our management. Preston runs the day-to-day operations. He rehired 4 of the original staff who'd left during Clifton's tenure, including a line cook named Dwayne who'd been with us since 2006 and who cried in the parking lot when Preston called him. I drove down for the reopening. Preston had put Loretta's smothered pork chops back on the regular menu, not the specials board, the regular menu, with a small note next to them that said, Original Recipe, 2001. I stood in the kitchen for a while before service started and looked at the used commercial grill that was somehow still there, still working, and I thought about $12,000 in credit card debt, and 16 tables and a woman who remembered every customer's order without writing it down. I didn't cry until I was back in the car. I'm 63 years old and I've had 2 knee replacements, and I'm allowed to cry in my car. People ask me if I'm angry at Clifton. It's a reasonable question. The honest answer is that I was, for a long time. The anger was clean and specific, and it kept me focused during the years when I needed focus. But anger is a fuel that runs out, and when it runs out, what's underneath it is the thing you have to decide what to do with. What's underneath mine is grief, for my wife, for the years I lost, for the brother I thought I had, who turned out to be someone I didn't know as well as I believed. I don't have much to say to Clifton. He's still in Augusta, from what I understand. We have not spoken since that phone call when his voice was thin. What I do have is this: a flagship restaurant that my son runs the way his mother would have wanted, a back porch with 2 chairs facing a yard where I'm going to plant tomatoes in the spring, and the knowledge that I did it clean. My father worked 31 years in a tire plant and never complained. He just worked, and he saved, and he made sure we had what we needed. That's what I tried to do. I think I'm finally getting there. If you've made it this far, you know why I had to tell this story. Not for sympathy, I'm past needing that, but because I know there are people watching this who have had the same thing taken from them by someone they trusted. And I want you to hear this. It takes longer than you want. It costs more than you plan, and you will have days when the lawyer is telling you to be patient and the anger has run out and you're sitting in a parking lot in a Goodwill jacket wondering if any of it is worth it. It is. Document everything. Find the right attorney. Don't warn them you're coming. And do it clean. That part matters. Not just for the legal outcome, for what you have to live with after. The dawn comes. It just takes a while to get there. I've thought a lot about what made Clifton think he could get away with it. And honestly, I don't think he ever sat down and planned it out, the way a criminal plans a heist. I think he just started making small decisions, each one easy to justify at the time, and then the next one got a little easier, and the one after that, easier still, until he was signing documents that weren't his to sign and moving money that wasn't his to move. And by then he'd told himself the story so many times that he believed it. That's how it usually works, not with a dramatic choice, but with a long series of small ones, each one cheaper than the last. What I know is this: a man reaps what he plants. Not in some mystical sense, not because the universe keeps score, but because actions have consequences that compound over time the same way interest does. Clifton's choices created a paper trail. His comfort created sloppiness. His assumption that I was too sick or too old or too beaten down to come back created the opening that Patricia Soto walked right through. He built the conditions of his own undoing, and I built the conditions of my own recovery. Not by being lucky, but by doing what my father taught me without ever saying it directly. He showed me by example that you get up, you document, you find the right people, you are patient, and you do not let anger make your decisions for you. I am not a perfect man. I have made my own small, cheap decisions over the years that I'm not proud of. But in this, I tried to do it clean. And doing it clean is what made the outcome stick. Preston is the part of this I think about most. He was 26 and grieving and scared, and he trusted the wrong man, a man he had every reason to trust. I don't carry any anger toward my son for that. What I carry is something closer to admiration, because when he started to understand what had happened, he didn't hide from it. He went back and read the documents. He started asking questions. He called me. A lesser man would have stayed comfortable in the wrong thing rather than face the discomfort of the right one. Preston chose the harder thing, and that tells me everything I need to know about who he is. There's a lesson in there about what we owe the people who come after us. Not money. Not buildings with their name on the door. What we owe them is the example of how to handle hard things without losing yourself in the process. I think about Loretta every day, and I think she would say I handled it right. Not perfectly. I had days when the anger was all I had and I let it run too hot, but right in the direction and the outcome. She was always the better judge of those things than I was. If you're watching this and someone has taken something from you, something you built, something you loved, something that had your wife's handwriting on the original menu, I want you to hear me say this plainly. The path back is longer than you want it to be, and it requires more from you than you feel like giving. Document everything. Find a Patricia Soto. Don't warn them. Do not let the anger run the decisions. And plant the tomatoes again when you're ready. That part matters too.